moment, person and hybrid event at ADB is a team auditorium, so you are part of the first year today. And I'm inviting now Jeff Taylor to provide us with the welcome remarks and with the context of the event.
Thank you very much, Susan. My name's Jeff Taylor. I'm the Deputy Director General of PPFD and the Procurement, Portfolio and Financial Management Department of ADB. I wish you all hello, good morning, evening, afternoon, whatever time that may be, and a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining this event in person and virtually. I'm pleased to be here today to open this roundtable on sustainable procurement and exploring the question why sustainable procurement is critical to the climate agenda. This event is our first hybrid knowledge event since the onset of the pandemic, so I'm particularly excited by it. We're getting back to the old way or the new way of doing business. I'm very happy. Since the onset of the pandemic, we have faced a series of challenges that threaten livable and prosperous future for many people across the planet. And this has hit the world's poorest the hardest. The COVID-19 pandemic endures, hurting economies. Food and energy shortages fueled by global events have driven up inflation, creating the worst cost of living crisis in a generation, if not longer. Against this backdrop, there are increasing climate calamities caused by climate change, threatening extreme weather events, endangering ecosystems, further threatening lives and livelihoods. With less than 8 years to go to meet the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which represent our best chance of building a green and just future for all, we must urgently draw on every tool available. Sustainable public procurement is one of those. Systemically linking public procurement to sustainable development outcomes and aligning public spending with the national government objectives, we can not only generate value for money and increase value for money secured through public procurement, but also contribute to the wider benefits to society, the economy, and minimizing environmental impact. Public procurement exceeds $13 trillion annually. That's approximately 15% of global GDP. As a leading regional bank, ADB has financed contracts totaling $40 billion over the last 5 years and over $11 billion last year alone. The potential for that to leverage positive outcomes is significant. This presents a tremendous potential to leverage public procurement as a strategic tool to influence and shape markets towards a greener and more innovative approach. This will have a significant positive impact on reducing climate change, if done well, mitigation and adaptation, address social issues, promote economic and institutional and sustainable development. In line with ADB's Strategy 2030, ADB's full commitment with the Paris Agreement by July 2023, ADB has identified procurement as one of the key functions supporting and promoting sustainability in its operations. In April 2017, ADB approved its new procurement policy, which allowed for greater flexibility in procurement in our operations and a fit-for-purpose approach. This is helping us to better respond to our clients' procurement needs through improving quality, reducing overall procurement time, and enhancing procurement delivery systems. Our procurement policy and regulations encourage our borrowers to actively consider and apply sustainable public procurement, recognizing that the ticket price alone seldom is the pure representation of value. In 2018, ADB approved Strategy 2030. At its core, it focuses on achieving a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia, with emphasis, for the purpose of this presentation, sustainable. ADB seeks to promote its value to its developing member countries by combining finance, knowledge, and partnerships, and strives to actively promote knowledge exchange and collaboration as well as supporting both our own and DMC's journeys towards more sustainable procurement practices. In December 2021, we published our guidance note on sustainable public procurement, and I encourage everybody to read it if you have not done so already. We have also launched a capacity building initiative just this week on training internally our staff on sustainable public procurement, and we will be scaling that up to our borrowers. Some great work from Jenny there. She'll touch on this later. Today's event is a key opportunity to bring ADB together with various leaders and thinkers from academia, from the United Nations, governments and industries and civil society organizations, to share resources on how we can all walk the talk to adopt more sustainable public procurement practices. I'd therefore like to thank SDCC, represented here by Susan, and my colleagues in PPFD, represented here by Jenny, for the great work they put in organizing this event. And by working together and leveraging the diversity of thinking, we can make sustainable procurement the endemic systemic standard and play a pivotal role in meeting our aspirations under 2030 and our clients' needs. And with that, I will say thank you very much for your time. I hope you find this as interesting as I expect it to be, and I will hand you over to Jenny. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenny Chu. I'm a procurement specialist at PPFD of ADB. I've been working on the Sustainable Procurement Initiative for the last few years since its inception, with collaborating with other team members in PPFD as well as other teams in the bank, especially SCCC. It's a pleasure to be here today to share with you ADB's work today on sustainable procurement. Why did we draft the guidance? It is important now, especially to the climate agenda, the various intervention we can make to align it procurement with the climate change agenda, UN SDG, and other strategic priorities. And the important to work with DMC and market, as well as other stakeholders to achieve that particular goal. So the first I want to highlight is there is a difference between conventional procurement and sustainable public procurement, in the sense that the conventional procurement mainly focusing on the act of purchasing or obtaining good, work, and services based on cost, whereas sustainable public procurement is pretty much you purchasing with combining hard and smart, taking into account environmental, social, economical, institutional impact of the entity spending. And it allows government to meet the need for good services, works, utilities in a way that achieve value for money on a whole of life basis in terms of generating benefit not only to the organization, but to the wider society and economy at large, while remaining within the carrying capacity of the environment. It is a systemic approach to identify and encourage the procurement of good, work, and services that are assessed to be less damaging to the environment during the production, use, disposal, than other good or services that serve a similar purposes, while also consider economic, social, institutional impact. I think there is an important distinction between sustainable infrastructure and sustainable procurement, where ADB is already doing a lot of work on sustainable infrastructures, where we are creating projects that's creating sustainable impact. But procurement, that sustainable procurement itself is the process and does not refer to the procurement of green or sustainable infrastructure, but it's more about the consideration they're taking into account to enhance that sort of broader outcome to maximize what is possible. On the slide here, there's also another key point that we want to highlight in a guidance note that we commonly get asked, which is there a distinction between safeguard requirement and sustainable procurement? There are different layers of sustainable procurement that's outlined in our guidance note. The first layer is the minimum requirement based on the safeguard standard that is pretty much doing no harm, referring to the particular safeguard perspective. And the next layer up is what you can do more to enhance that broader outcome and possibility through the market. Sorry. The second layer is to enhance the minimum requirement by adopting extra sustainability requirement that is either mandatory or prefer to maximize that broader outcome and depends on what is available from the market. And finally, the top tier that we want to achieve over time would be getting improved sustainability performance or leadership from the vendor. And as Jeff mentioned, really shaping the market. And that's something that takes a journey rather than something that will occur overnight. So we're quite excited that we're embarking on this conversation now. And why is it particularly relevant to ADB's climate change agenda? Next slide, please. As mentioned by our climate action plan, the battle against climate change will be won or lost in Asia and the Pacific. And as Asia's and Pacific Climate Bank, working with government and civil society to mobilize financing and implement cutting-edge knowledge, we must embrace all the tools we can call on. And sustainable procurement is one of these tools. The report from IPCC predicts that if developing countries expand their infrastructure to average current global emission, the construction sector alone will emit 470 billion tons of carbon dioxide by 2050. And this is more than the remaining carbon budget to avoid dangerous climate change. The ADB, with our broad portfolio of infrastructure projects, is already playing a leadership role in what we do in the project design element. And we can do more with adopting sustainable procurement as a powerful tool to advance the climate agenda and the impact that we can create. Sustainable procurement is really a means to an end. It's an enabler to achieve the outcome that our strategy 2030, our climate agenda, Paris Agreement, and UN SDG in particular, and then realizing that through the project sustainability priorities and achieving that through prioritizing what are the goals and then selecting the appropriate intervention of procurement in the form of specification, evaluation criteria, or contract management tools to achieve and enhance the particular outcome. So the introduction and incorporation of sustainable consideration in procurement process is not really meant to be a complicated and a separate challenging endeavor. It's really just increasing the consideration of existing country level priorities of a DMC combined with identify risk and opportunity for given projects in procurement processes. Next slide, please. In our guidance note, we've categorized the sustainable procurement key principle into 4 pillars, and all of that is critical to advance the ADB climate agenda: environmental, social, economical, and institutional. Next slide, please. And in order to help implement the sustainable procurement, developing best practice framework consisting of various tools that support the implementation of policy, combining with training and communication is very important. And also managing the engagement with the country level context through dialogue with through our field offices, through the government, and engaging with the supplier to understand what is available so that we can calibrate the requirement on a case-by-case basis so that it's fit for purpose. So ADB has, our team has sort of embarked on this journey to develop various tools, guidance note, and training material to complete the best practice framework. And we are on the journey to launch a capacity building program next year to help really take that into action rather than just sitting on a guidance note level so that we can actually see the drive of behavioral change. Next slide, please. There has been a variety of guidance note material developed by ADB to date that's outlined here. Sustainable public procurement being the latest one published in December 2021. It touches on a few particular concepts of how do we consider sustainable procurement in the strategic procurement planning process, building on previous guidance note that's already published to drive value for money. minimize risk and also maximizing opportunity in the procurement process. ADB is taking a leadership role in this space and filling a gap in the knowledge sphere, especially on sustainable procurement focused on infrastructure, construction, and works. We hope that we can contribute our knowledge to the international best practice in this arena, because the impact of sustainable infrastructure in construction is quite significant. Next slide, please. Some of the key messages from the guidance note is strengthening country system and capacity building. It's important to align with the country's self-identified goals and then make it sort of customized to the context, and also ensure the buy-in from our government stakeholders so that it is relevant to what they want to achieve. And then consider sustainable procurement intervention early at the strategic procurement planning stage, engaging with the market to understand what are the possible solutions while balancing open, fairness, transparency of the procurement principle. And then beyond policy level intervention, developing tools to help implement sustainable procurement in project and contract to make it easier to actually put it into action. And finally, we recognize to support the tools that I've just mentioned. At the back of the guidance note, we developed various sector, category, and thematic-based references and case study to help the users to readily use the suggestions from the guidance note. Next slide, please. One of the other key messages from the guidance note is deriving best value from procurement essentially means striking a balance with every purchase of cost, quality, service, and sustainability. By adopting sustainable procurement doesn't mean that we don't take cost into account. There is a common misconception that more sustainable option is more expensive, and that doesn't need to be the case. If you consider the long-term saving from more reliable and resilient procurement and more optimal solution from the market by early engagement with them, it can derive really good value as well. Another thing that I want to highlight is that incorporating sustainability in procurement is not meant to be a taxing process on the borrower or ADB staff. We hope that after the rollout of the trainings, adopting the tools and resources necessary to implement sustainability into procurement, it will integrate seamlessly to existing procurement process, such as the strategic procurement planning and also our bidding document. So we hope that the sustainability consideration included in procurement is calibrated to make sure that it's fit for the context and align with what is feasible for a given DMC and project scenario. Another thing that we want to highlight in the guidance note is there are different intervention points in the procurement cycle for sustainable procurement, starting from the country partnership strategy level through the planning phase, the conceptualization of the project, preparations of the bid, designing of the criteria, how you evaluate them, what you need to do for contract management, as well as very importantly, closure of a project and adopt good practices and lesson learned to carry it forward to continue the knowledge improvement. So next slide, please. In the guidance note, we have suggested some of the activities that you can adopt at different stage of the project procurement cycle to enhance the sustainability outcome. In particular, linking to our other guidance note, the merit point system, you can adopt in the bid creation phase the kind of selection criteria and methodology to sort of set the criteria to a level that makes it enticing and comfortable for the supplier to engage in, so that they will actually engage and contribute to the thinking and offering what is the best foot forward to give the best bid that will in turn drive the benefit for the projects and for the government. Next slide, please. Another thing to complement the guidance note that we have published last year is a training program. As Jeff mentioned, we are in piloting phase of the training program at the moment. The training program is intended to be delivered to ADB staff, borrowers, consultants, as well as the market at different point in time of the procurement cycle in a modular approach so that it can add real-time value to the project implementation process. To complement the training modules, there is also briefing for the market to send a signal to the market that this is a new important criteria, factors that we take into account in ADB's procurement to equip them with the thinking and consideration to be successful in the biddings. Next slide, please. And finally, to implement the training and guidance note that we prepared, we are working with various teams across ADB to undertake some pilot between third quarter this year, pretty much now. We just completed a pilot training in Indonesia and further pilot training and support initiative in other regions as well to quarter two next year. And following that, we will refine the content of the capacity initiative and combining with country-based example, sector-based example, and thematic-based example to roll it out to internal and also external stakeholders. So on the slide here is a snapshot of the various pilots that we are going to be rolling out over the next 2 quarters. And the final message is that in order to contribute to the success of sustainable procurement, it really takes the village across ADB, but also with external stakeholders, ranging from procurement team, from suppliers, from project officers, analysts, consultants, the government, input from our safeguard and thematic specialists, and also very importantly, our country representative to ensure that the field perspective is taken into account. We hope that through facilitating the sustainable procurement process in a systemic manner, we can join the dot and untie the knot to embrace sustainable procurement as a powerful tool to advance the broader outcome in ADB's climate change agenda. Thank you, and I'll now hand it over to Suzanne to facilitate the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I think we got a good overview. I'd like to introduce you also, Jenny. Jenny is a procurement officer. By background, she's a lawyer and an engineer. So one of our very talented female staff members here in the bank. So thank you for leading this work. And I'd like to introduce the panel now to you, to everyone here. So we have with us here Sanjay Kumar. He came from India yesterday, right? He arrived. He's actually the chief material manager of the Indian Railway. And you're also an engineer, but you also studied public policy, right? And we'll hear more about it later. He's really the champion of sustainable procurement in the Indian Railway, and you'll share more about it with us. We have with us on stage also here Ben Fern. She is the global head of infrastructure and sustainability at the Open Contracting Partnership, right? This is an NGO. And then we have with us online, you can see them here, Rainer Cattell. He is the deputy director of the University College London Institute for Public Innovation and Public Purpose. I hope I did the right way around. We've worked with Rainer already for a while on mission-driven economies, and he'll speak about it later. And then we have with us here Carsten Hansen. He is actually the chief of global procurement of UNDP. And funny story, we got in touch through LinkedIn when he saw that we posted our procurement guidance note and got interested in this. So this is the power of social media, just reminding everyone, talk about your work on social media. And then we have Nick Braxton here. He's joining us from New Zealand today. He is the principal sustainability advisor of the Link Alliance, and he's delivering stations, tunnels, and rail systems in New Zealand. So you can see we have an interesting mix of experts here today to talk about sustainable procurement, what it means, how realistic it is, and why it's so important for ADB to take this forward, maybe as one of our critical knowledge areas. So let's start our conversation, our panel, and I would like to invite Rainer to share a bit about how mission-driven economies and the approach to mission-driven economies links with public procurement and why you think public procurement is such a powerful tool to transform economies and countries. Rainer, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Susan, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, although here is in a hybrid format, so I think this is probably the future of our event, and I think so far you're doing a great job in managing the room and the online audiences. So well done. And yeah, I always enjoy ADB events. I think it's a really interesting organization, and looking what you do in procurement space. I think congratulations. I think it's really great. So yeah, I think there's a lot of governments in the world that are now thinking about how do we go beyond economic growth. Of course, economic growth matters, or any kind of growth in terms of like exports or investments is really important for countries and governments. But I think many governments are now asking the question, what kind of growth do we actually want? Because you can grow and be a very unequal country. You can grow and have a very large carbon footprint. So I think a lot of countries are asking about the quality of growth, and how do we actually, as we heard from Jeff and Jenny as well, how do we actually shape markets to deliver more equitable and more greener outcomes? I think this is where this idea of setting ambitious policy goals or missions or challenges, derived from SDGs and similar ideas are so important, so that government should not just pursue growth, but actually specific kind of growth. So it can be decarbonizing, it can be around health, it can be around female participation, it can be on all of these kind of issues, but the main thing is that we actually try to enable government departments work together among themselves, but also with private industry to achieve those policy goals or those ambitious goals. And this is where, of course, the idea of missions now many governments are pursuing, and you can see missions take a very different kind of shape and form. You can see many countries focusing on decarbonizing, but specifically, for instance, around food. You can see food systems as a mission-oriented policies in Sweden, but also in Mexico. You can see mining and other resources that are really relevant for missions. So it's a really wide array of examples. But I think procurement, of course, is a very direct way of implementing these kind of ambitious policy goals, because you can embed some of those criteria that are relevant for you in procurement guidelines, as we just saw from Jenny's presentation as well. So I think procurement becomes a really important market shaping tool for government agencies. And as we heard from Jeff, procurement is roughly 15% of global GDP. So it's already a spending that is there. So it's not a new investment, which I think is really important, because a lot of government, especially in developing countries, ask, where do I get the money for ambitious, gender equality agenda, for instance? But then you say, well, you're actually spending 10 to 20% of your GDP already on anything from infrastructure to office supplies. I think you can already start to implement a lot of those ambitious policy goals through existing investment. And that's why procurement is so important. It's not about new investment, although that might be also important, but it's actually really about using better the existing investment.
Rainer, on this, which country is currently kind of leading when it comes to using public procurement to create new sustainable industries or to create new supply chains? Can you give an example?
I think there are really quite a lot of interesting examples. Of course, the European Union has done a lot of work as a larger marketplace, creating those guidances, as you have now done with ADB as well. So EU has been, since almost 20 years, creating various green procurement guidances, various strategic procurement guidances, and now also increasingly around innovative procurement through R&D spending and whatnot. So you can find, particularly, I think, in the Nordic countries, you can find really interesting and very ambitious examples around construction, but also food systems, but also waste systems, even digital solutions and social policies. So you can find really ambitious and very interesting examples, I think, how we can use procurement to really change not only what is being the outcome of procurement, but also who's actually procuring the products for you. So more local industry, and try to diversify the local industry this way as well. So yeah, all of these countries have done a really great job, I think. But also, as I said, you can find really interesting examples in South Africa, for instance, around employment. You can find interesting examples in Australia around resilient production systems, especially around climate and extreme weather conditions. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on really around the world. I think it's very good that ADB has stepped into that role as well now.
Thank you, Rainer. So good examples. You mentioned European countries, a lot of focus on environment sustainability. So I'll
Yeah.
come back to you later, Rainer. Thank you very much. Let's now move to Sanjay. I mentioned this already. You are one of the thought leaders on sustainable procurement in the railway agency in India, and you started working on this around 2005 or six, right? And at the same time, when EU, I think, started some of these policy. So, what do you think? Why is it only now coming to the attention of governments that this is a very, important and powerful tool?
Thank you, Susan. I hope people are able to hear me out. So, when we started journey on system public procurement in 2004 and 2005, and some of the European countries, they had legislation even back in 90s, right? So, but finally, the European Union came up with the legislation in 2004, and that created momentum, in the other parts of the world, that how do we use, the power of procurement to drive the market transformation, right? Once you send a signal to the market players, they're able to take up their signals, and they invest in research, design, development and manufacturing of the products that meets your requirement, right? In terms of sustainability, like product which consumes lesser energy, fewer resources, which is easy to disassemble, easy to dispose of, and which is easy to recycle, reuse, and other things. So why the focus is now, right? This very important question. So from 2004 and 5 to when we move onward, in 2015 was a very, I will say, the watershed year in which we adopted two important declarations. One was SDGs, right? And the second was Paris Climate Change Agreement, right? Which the world leader, they signed. And if you look at the SDGs, SDG 7, SDG 12 is on sustainable consumption and production, which has been recognized a power tool for moving on the sustainable development. And SDG 12.7 is specifically on procurement. How do we use procurement, power procurement to drive the sustainability into the world? And the second is also equally important, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, right? So as a part of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, most of the countries, now they are declaring that, okay, by 2050, I will become carbon neutral. For example, China has said 2060. Most of the European countries, they have said 2050, right? India has said 2070, right? Yeah. So, the SDGs is not only about the government acting for the achieving the sustainable development goals, but it's also for the business, right? And the business has also started declaring that, okay, this is how I'm going to achieve carbon neutrality or net zero by year so and so, right? So, but if you look at the, where are the footprint and where are the hotspot, right? So basically GHG emissions, if you divide them into a scope 1, a scope 2, a scope 3, right? A scope 1 and a scope 2 is a direct emission, which is coming from the, whatever electricity which you consume and the product which you are using. But a scope 3 emissions, right? A scope 3 emissions is coming from your supply chain, right? And you know how much it constitutes? In certain cases, in certain businesses, it constitutes roughly about 90%, right? So today, if any business, any government, any organization wants to achieve carbon neutrality or net zero, they cannot implement it, they cannot reach the goal unless they start focusing on the supply chain. That means on procurement. So that is why the focus is on procurement, right? When I started my first Facebook group on regarding procurement, public sustainable procurement, that was probably the first group on Facebook on discussing green procurement, sustainable procurement, and all. But today, if you see the LinkedIn, if you see the Facebook, there are not less than 100 groups available on the sustainable procurement. So that shows the kind of explosion, and the kind of recognition which the sustainable procurement has got to deliver the sustainability agenda, right? So people are realizing that, okay, once we don't focus on this, we are not going to achieve whatever we are committing. So that is how the agency.
Yeah, so
Thank you.
it comes back to it takes a whole village to drive this change. What does it mean exactly, right? The private sector, the government, it creates communities of practices to talk about sustainable procurement, but specifically now about the railway agency in India. How are you changing how you procure and how are you influencing supply chains already?
Well, if you are looking at the country level, like, then it's very important to look at the local context and what is the public procurement framework in any particular country, right? So in any particular country, you can have a public procurement legislation or regulation, right? They may or may not, uh, facilitate integrating sustainability criteria into the procurement decision. But that is not the end, right? In that case, you have to start looking at the sector legislation. What is the legislation on e-waste? What is the legislation on waste management? What is the legislation on disposal of, buildings? What is the legislation on take back of batteries and so on? And you also need to leverage, the international convention, right? Say, for example, Indian Railway way back when the legislation was not conducive, we use the Montreal Protocol for switching over to the, environment-friendly refrigerant for our air cooling need in the air-conditioned coaches. So when we say sustainable procurement framework, actually the framework constitutes of public procurement, sector legislation, international, convention and commitment which we have signed, and we need to, see that whether the different legislation available in the countries, whether they talk to each other or not, right? So if they don't talk to each other, then we need to work on how do we harmonize this different legislation, so that we are able to integrate sustainability into the purchasing decision and we are able to move forward. So 2017, we, revise our procurement manual. It's not, I would say that the best in the world, but it gives you, some leeway, some entry point for integrating sustainability at different stages of the procurement decision, right? But, we thought that in 2017, now that we have the manual, so now sustainability procurement should move on a fast track. But we realized that, in a similar conference, I asked the group of people with the more than, 12 or 13, 15 years of experience, like, have you anybody read the latest manual? Does it? So there were hardly few people who said that I read the manual and whether the manual provides for integrating sustainability into the procurement decision. Right? So that was a challenge, and that is a challenge for a country like India. Like, we have 7 million public procurement professionals who are dealing in some or other way, right? So it's a huge number. How do you address, how do you, enhance their capacity on sustainable procurement? So that is one of the challenges we are not able to address till now. But in 2018, we realized that, having a manual or having a legislation or regulation is not the only thing which is going to, put the policy into the practice, right? So with a lot of discussion and all, we were able to convince the government of India that, okay, let us constitute a task force, right? Because procurement is a subject, especially sustainable procurement, we need to acknowledge that if procurement professionals want to implement it alone, they cannot do it because they don't have an understanding of sustainability. And if sustainability procurement sustainable professionals want to implement it alone, it will not happen, right? So we need to start, learning how to collaborate with each other to take forward the organizational agenda. So we were able to convince the government that, okay, let us form a task force, right? Constituting, people from the different ministries to address the issue holistically so that we can implement, address the challenges which we have in implementing sustainable procurement in a holistic manner. So, and one of the mandate was to come up with the, draft national action plan, right? Unfortunately, we have not been able to come that. There are challenges in that area as well, but it's a work in progress, right? We are moving on that, and but despite that, fact that we do not have a draft agenda and so on, but we have sectoral legislation, as I said, earlier. So we were able to harmonize some of the sectoral legislation, right? So, for example, we started using the policy on inclusion of MSME into our procurement agenda. So now we give purchase preference to the MSMEs, 15% purchase preference. Right. Similarly, we give purchase preference to the women-owned enterprises, right? And we are also, we have used the take back laws for the battery management. There is a legislation on battery management. So we have used that legislation to, in our procurement system, right? So how to integrate, EPR into the our procurement system. Then we have started moving on services, procurement of goods to procurement of services. Why? Because when you buy a product, right? What happens? Basically, the ownership changes from one place to another. But the vendors or the contracting community, they do not have an incentive, right, to minimize the quantity of product which you are buying, because their profitability, is vested in how much more product they are able to supply to you, right? And our interest is like how much minimum we can buy so that we are able to manage our stuff, right? So it's not aligned. Our motive and their motives is not aligned, right? So when you move to services, right? So now they have an incentive because the ownership of the product rests with the contractor or vendors, right? And now they think of designing a product which is easily reusable, which can be, which can long laster. They are able to increase the durability, and there is, incentive. Our motivation are aligned. Like they also reduce the consumption of the product which are being used. We also want to reduce the consumption of products. So it's a we have been for both parties. So that we have started, but that we have started only for the few products. Say, for example, computers, photocopiers, vehicle, and so on. But there are a lot of, opportunity in these sectors. When you're buying products, how do you move from buying product to buying services?
So this is the area for innovative approaches, right? Where ADB could probably also do more, and it requires trained professionals and communities of practices to find these kind of solutions.
Yeah, I think, ADBs, their procurement professionals are well trained, I believe. And we have, especially I have a very high regard for them. But, what happened, and normally in the public sector, public sector and public procurement, which are based in, different parts of the world, they recognize bank professional as a kind of a role model because they have been always at the front of procurement reform. Like they incentivize procurement reform in various parts of the country. I think they were behind, the whole e-procurement system, e-tendering in procurement system across the world. So, but somehow in sustainable public procurement, they were behind, right? And that led to the thinking in the public sectors, and public procurement like us and others, that if the bank is not doing it, what is the need for doing to us to do it?
So what should ADB do to kind of push the sustainable procurement agenda?
Yeah, a lot of things, but they can see, as a financer, they have a leverage, right? When they are financing a project, they have a leverage, right? And once they are able to demonstrate the power of procurement to gain the sustainability outcome, right? That can become a, good learning for the country procurement system officials, right? And the second thing which they can do is, banks usually works on a project, right? But the outcome of the project, once the project ends, the learning lessons is not taken forward, right? So how can they build a, institutional capacity wherever they are working, so that the learning which are coming from the out of the project, that is continued and adopted and progressed, right?
Across.
So say for example, can they create a fund, right, where those funds could be used for capacity building and professionalization of procurement function in Asia, right? Can they institute a award for procurement professional or procurement organization, right, which honor or award and recognizes the procurement professional or organization working in the social public procurement, right? So these are the incentives they can create, and for that, I don't think any of the government will have any kind of objection.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's leadership, and then it's the knowledge sharing, the lessons learned sharing, and investing in building professionalism in procurement, right? And of course, strengthening institutions. So this brings me now to, thank you so much, Sanjay. I'll come back to you later. This brings me now to Carsten. And with that question, Carsten, what does it mean for us as development organizations? How can we ourselves walk the talk and actually practice sustainable procurement? I think you have some examples, some experience that you can share with us from UNDP, and I'll invite you now to do so.
Oh, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Sanjay. I think what's really changed for us and really increased the pressure perhaps on international organizations to walk the talk, as you say, is that there's this increased awareness, not just at a policy level, but also at an operationalization. How do we walk the talk? How do we operationalize our internal procurement and align that with the development objectives of the organizations that we work for? So that has been very critical. I think what has also changed that we need to follow up on is, of course, the scope change of sustainable procurement. So the UN has been leading the sustainable procurement agenda for decades, but what I think has changed is the scope. Initially, we were looking a lot on environmental issues, environmental sustainability, pollution, etc. Now, of course, with the climate change agenda, we're looking a lot on emissions reductions within environmental issues, but also social responsibility has become a big issue. So we're working a lot on gender responsive procurement, integrating disability considerations into our procurement, human rights issues and transparency issues in global supply chains. And this is really following this growing national body of regulations that are emerging from many of the donor countries, of course, that we serve. From the European Union, for instance, there's a lot of work on due diligence in supply chains coming up, and we are following up on that and trying to align accordingly. So there's this increased demand and expectations from the donors. The scope has also increased, I think, on circularity. Circularity, a new concept that we are trying to understand and how to integrate that into a public procurement process. I think there's many approaches to that. There's the simple one where you integrate or sort of circularity principles and concepts into existing procurement processes. But if you really want to fully leverage circularity as a concept in public procurement, you need to talk about asking the right questions further upstream, perhaps. Do we really need this? And if we really need this, do we need to own it? Can we make it a servicization product? Meaning that you don't need to buy it and own it through a traditional procurement process, but you can buy the service. Meaning the old-fashioned leasing your photocopying machines, leasing your vehicles, and so on. But you can go beyond that, and you can lease infrastructure, frankly. So that's one of those change dynamics that we need to catch up with as international organizations.
And what is the challenge, Carsten, for you and UNDP to kind of advance this agenda, the sustainable procurement agenda?
So from my perspective, I come from the practitioner side. So I'm tasked with actually implementing sustainable procurement concepts. And I have to say that from that perspective, it's a lot more challenging. I think we agree on where we want to go. We want to integrate sustainability at the policy level. We have a lot of support from our executive management. but it's where the rubber hits the road kind of thing. When the practitioners need to integrate sustainability concepts into, in our case, 1,000 unique specific categories across 3,585 types and goods and services. Doing that, as Sanjay was alluding to as well, through a very potentially decentralized procurement organization. How do you even catch up in terms of developing the right capabilities to do that? So we actually developed a model. I found it a bit frustrating that we couldn't get better progress. So I wanted to understand what are the challenges and barriers. And frankly, they are multidimensional. So the first one is really establishing a clear, firm policy and regulatory framework that guides public procurement practitioners in what they can do, what is mandatory, what is optional, so that they don't fall into this concern about being subjective. I mean, procurement practitioners, public procurement practitioners in particular, are very risk averse. So unless you give them clarity and guidance, they will not follow it for good reason. We are custodians of taxpayers' money. We are audited. We need to make sure that transparency is there. The other part that was less obvious was the behavioral change component. You need in an organization to integrate behavioral change. You need to integrate sustainability targets into people's annual performance goals. It's a very micro level, but we actually did that in UNDP, where we said each of our team leads actually had a sustainability performance goal. And that signaled to them that the organization was very clear on their targets, and it had the support and the priority of the organization. The third component was the capacity. I alluded to this. We have 1,017 unique categories last year in our spend portfolio. Sustainability requirements and integration is very category specific. Whether you're doing sustainable procurement of construction or pencils or vehicles, etc., it requires an expertise in that particular category. And therefore, it's a challenge to integrate in decentralized procurement systems. So you really need a tool or a framework in which you embed that capability across your model. The last point, which is perhaps less obvious as well, is the market. We forget the market. We need to ensure that the market has the absorption capacity to meet the requirements on sustainability that we're introducing. And that will vary. If you're buying something in Sweden or in Finland, the market may be well prepared because there already is an existing demand. But if you're buying elsewhere in the world where that demand is not obvious, the market may not be fully prepared. So you need to build those 4 dimensions together as you take your sustainability journey forward. Over.
I think the last point you made on building the market is now a nice bridge for Nick to kind of build on. Bridge literally as an infrastructure. Because Nick, we spoke when we prepared for this panel, right, about your experience, what it actually takes to have these conversations with the contractors about what does sustainability mean, how can they translate the kind of ambition and vision in actual contracts and implementing and building something. So Nick, if you can share some of your experience, how difficult is it to create this market, to change the private sector and the contractors in that sense to provide these kind of sustainable solutions, infrastructure solutions or products?
Yeah, thanks, Susanna, and thank you for having me here. It's I should say it's 7 o'clock at night here, and I'm in the office. And if it suddenly goes dark, it's because the lights have automatically switched off. Someone will pop up, hopefully, and switch them on again. I think it's going to happen shortly. So if I disappear, I'm still here. I'm just in the dark temporarily. Yeah, to your question around the market responding, I guess. So we're a roughly $3 billion underground rail project. We do have some bridges though, and it's over long duration, sort of a staged build. And in 2015, when I started working on the project, I think when we came to our 2 main contractors and said we want to integrate some sustainability aspects into the construction process, and I think there was a lot of puzzled looks and sort of scratching heads. To help overcome that, we used an external framework, the Infrastructure Sustainability Rating System, which gave us good guidance. We set some targets, and then it's really a 2-way process. I guess we had an understanding of what we wanted to achieve, and we had knowledge around things like, for instance, embodied carbon in the materials we're using. But they brought their construction know-how and the sort of nitty-gritty of how things actually work. And I think meeting those two things together, having an ongoing conversation about how we can achieve those targets using those two knowledge bases, really helped for us to work out a way to achieve the targets that we mutually agreed we were trying to achieve. And then, of course, that was working with our main contractors. And in construction, it's not the main contractors often are managing a lot of subcontractors. And so that same process has to happen at the next level down. So I think there's a point there around, you know, you've got your high level policy, what you want to achieve. Maybe you've got your larger contractors, and under that you've got your subcontractors. So it's a conversation that needs to go all the way down the chain to the people who are actually working on the ground, delivering what you're trying to achieve.
That when we prepared for this conversation, you said there's a lot of dialogue that needs to happen, right? Between, and you are leading this, between the subcontractors, the contractors, and then kind of the team which is, you know, has designed this infrastructure, has developed the bidding documents. How is this best moderated, these conversations, especially when it's all about, at the end, about cost and timelines and, you know, delivering something tangible?
Yeah, well, I think it's really, I mean, it's really important to have that really clear right from the start. I think there was, Jenny was talking earlier. Oh, there we go. I'm in the dark momentarily. Hopefully the lights will come on shortly. We had this, early on, we had a real, you need to have a really high policy and agreed targets. And then from there, they drop down and you have those conversations with the main contractor. And then it's not just something set in the contract that is, you know, you hope is going to be delivered at the end of the project. You really have to be working on it the whole time. So you have to be meeting with your subcontractors and getting them to, you know, making sure that those targets are going down to those and that they're performing on them. If they're not, you help them to improve their performance. It's not something you can just sort of set and forget. You've got to really follow it through all the way.
I think this is an important point, Nick, on you need to be very clear about the outcome and what you want to achieve. And I think this is a good point for you to come in, Ben, about how do you design these sustainable procurement frameworks for certain projects and programs where you have very clear conversations about what you actually want to achieve, the outcomes, and how do you measure them? And can you give examples how you've done this in some of the projects you've worked on?
Of course, thank you. Well, I think this is really the crux of the problem of what we're trying to achieve, right? It's really going all the way back to the design. And the single most important thing is really to make sure that, well, one, first of all, that you're clear about what the impact is that you want to achieve. Often people talk about sustainability like it's one whole thing, right? But we know that there are lots of different facets of sustainability. So the key thing is to be clear about what your impact is. So are you trying to reduce emissions, for example, or are you trying to do something in a more socially responsible way? So whether that's better worker welfare, or whether it's you know, something about shared prosperity, inclusive growth, job creation. So if you're clear about your impacts, then you can start to create a path to get to that impact. And very often people don't do that, right? People come to us and they say, oh, help us make our procurement more sustainable, but they don't really know what they mean by that. So the first is to be clear about your impact. And then it's to include it in your procurement processes and to price for it. So again, very often people want all of these wonderful things, and then they don't want to pay for it. One great example, you know, the Qatar World Cup is coming up. And 10 years ago, when they started that process, they were so many grand plans for it. It was going to be the greenest World Cup ever. It's going to be the most socially responsible. It's going to be the most ethical. It's going to be wonderful. They got designers to come in to design these labor camps, you know, for housing of the workers with swimming pools and tennis courts and all wonderful things. But none of it was included in any of the tenders. None of them were priced for. So in the end, none of it was built, right? And so then we get all of the problems that you get with large mega infrastructure projects and large sporting events. So the key thing is to really make sure that you're clear about your impact, you price for it and you put it into your tender, so then you can measure what the outcome is. The second thing is also to ensure that you have an inclusive process so that these decisions about what your goal is and how you achieve it is not being made in silos. So you're not just sitting in an ivory tower somewhere trying to create solutions that may not be fit for purpose. And the only way that you can do that is to make sure that you're user-led, that you've got all of your intended beneficiaries around the room, all the different stakeholders, whether it's the markets or whether it's communities, to check if what you're proposing is actually going to deliver for them. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing, really, it's about accountability and how can you ensure that? And one of the key ways is to ensure openness in your procurements. And we're talking about end-to-end procurements so that you can follow the money, you can follow the data to understand where you are and how you're performing. Because you can't improve what you can't measure, right? You can't change what you can't track. And the only way that you can do that is to make sure that you have this data and you have this information across the different cycles of procurement, across the different stages of procurement. So then you can see whether you're getting closer to your target or not. So if, for example, your goal is living wages for workers, you need to be capturing that data. And very often these data sets are not being captured. Very often we talk about improving opportunities for women or women-owned businesses, for example. But when you look at procurement systems, very often they don't have a category to capture gender. So you don't know whether a consultant is female or not. You don't know whether companies are women-owned or not. You don't know whether they're indigenous-owned or whatever your measure is. So how can you measure if you're improving, if you're not capturing this type of basic data?
And who is, so currently you're working on these databases, right? So who's funding that right now? Are governments interested to fund these databases, or who should finance that? Or should this be part of a bigger, of the project itself?
It's a really good question. So I think the answer is it depends. We have a lot of different governments who are doing lots of really innovative things. And a lot of it, the good news is that a lot of it is linked to procurement systems. So a lot of this data is actually already in procurement systems. It's just not being utilized in a very meaningful way. So you get a lot of data, particularly around the contracting processes, around the tenders and awards. Increasingly, we're seeing, different governments, from Colombia to Chile, Mexico is doing lots of really cool things, where they're increasing their data sets, to the planning stages, which tend to be quite opaque. So you'll have it internally and you have it in-house, but not necessarily being shared across agencies or with other stakeholders. And then the other gap often is at the implementation stage. So after contracts are awarded, you don't actually get a lot of information on how things are going, but that's also changing now. So part of it is being funded by governments. Part of it is being funded by multilaterals and bilaterals. There's a lot of funding from foundations on this as well. But I think the key thing is it's not really about just creating large databases. It's about using what you already have. And particularly in governments, a lot of that data is captured somewhere, unless you're wholly paper-based, right? But the key thing is that you often have lots of different systems with different pieces of information. And as Sanjay was saying earlier, sometimes these different agencies and systems don't talk to each other. And then you get these silos. So the key thing is about how can we use data so that people can talk to each other. And what that means is that we need a standardized, structured, machine-readable open data format so that you can get this kind of interoperability across the different agencies. An easy example is to help you conceptualize it, is you think about date formats. So if you have 07/03/2022, that means different things in different places. In the UK, it means the 7th of March. In the US, it means the 3rd of July. And to a human reader, when you read these things, you can make that kind of estimation. Well, this person's writing to me from the US, so it's probably, the 3rd of July. But when you run it through a machine, it can't make those judgments, right? Because then it reads as different things. So that's one of the big benefits of standardization, and how data, when you standardize it, you can join it up and you can make sense of what is going on. Are you actually achieving your targets or not?
Thank you. And maybe on this, Nick, maybe we can go back to you because you disappeared. Now you're back on this point. So in your case, on the projects you are working on, what kind of monitoring system do you have to show that you are actually implementing sustainable procurement practices?
Yeah, we collect a lot of data on exactly what we're going. So for instance, looking at our carbon footprint, we are collecting data off all of our suppliers on the resources they're using, and with a construction project, I think Sanjay talked about the scope 3 emissions, which for us is mainly the embodied carbon of materials, which is actually about 80% of our construction footprint. So it's really key that we collect all that data really closely. We've worked with our designers to try to make sure that our design is as efficient as possible. We tracked the projected carbon footprint during design using a digital engineering model for that. And then as we're building it, we're monthly collecting data from everyone really, and tracking that and reporting that back up to our management and back down to our suppliers.
Thank you, Nick. On this I think on this monitoring, what you're monitoring, which is very much about carbon emission and kind of the environmental climate aspect of it. I think interesting is a conversation we had, Sanjay, before, right? To kind of also find the right political agenda right now. And maybe you can share a few words. I know we are kind of close to wrapping up, and I want to make sure we can go back, hopefully, to everyone and to Jenny. What is your recommendation there right now? Is the entry point of climate and environment sustainability on the top of politicians right now, or is it maybe more the social agenda? How do we read the political economy?
Yeah, thank you, Jenny, for the very interesting discussion we had, and we are going to continue here as well. So, multilateral banks and multilateral institutions, I would say, they have played a very key role in, driving the sustainable procurement agenda across the world. And where they are driving to the, the poor and developing economies, right? Because countries in Europe, North America, and some other parts, even in Asia, a few countries, they are already developed, they have adopted for their own reason, because they thought that this is the reason why I want to adopt sustainable public procurement. But what has gone wrong, and that is one of the reasons why, the speed which we wanted to have and which we would have expected sustainable procurement to take off, is the overemphasis on environmental issues, right? So if you apply the same template, right, based on the experience in developed countries and industrialized economy, and if you bring it to the poor and developing economies, there is an issue. Why? Because the moment you bring the environmental criteria into the your procurement decision, right? So suddenly, there is a need of market assessment come into the picture, whether the market is ready or not, right? And for political, any political leaders, right, they would not like to implement a policy which impact their trade, that impacts their domestic industries, that impact local employment, right? So, so when you go forward to this country, poor and developing countries, they are not receptive, because they, okay, this is not addressing our constituency. In fact, if I adopt this policy, it is going to do more harm to my political constituency than benefit me in terms of, political dividend in the next election, right? So a better approach would be to start focusing on, the social issues which are near and dear to the political politician, right? If you start focusing on, okay, so we are working on something, we are bringing a policy which will provide employment opportunity to the local people, they will be very receptive. The labor union, they will also be supportive when you say that, okay, I want to improve the working condition of the workers who are working in the factories, right? We will ensure that they get the living wages. We'll ensure that, the women and the men, they get the equal payment for the work which they're doing in a particular time. So you have political constituency which are backing it, and political leaders will also be receptive to this idea. So my suggestion would be, whether a country wants to focus on social issues or environmental issues, let the ownership of that issue be decided by people who are there.
Yeah.
Right. From our end, we should not go, okay, you adopt, when we were starting sustainable procurement, you adopt buying sustainable paper. or you adopt buying sustainable content, but it's not none of our business. Let it be decided by and owned by the people who are, the in charge in the countries. So that will help, in taking it forward. And once people become accustomed, they will soon realize the power of procurement, because once they start doing it, they will soon realize. So once they become accustomed, right, then we can follow on different agenda and prioritize different, policies for addressing it. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Very important point here. We're coming to the end of our conversation. I can see that all of you have already in the panel here have started to reply to some of the questions we had. So please, if there are any questions that the virtual audience still has, please drop them here. We still have over 130 people joining virtually. We had up to 160, I think, at the beginning and during the mid of the webinar. We will also, because this is recorded, we will post this so that everyone can watch it in ADB. So now, Jenny, I think I would like to come back to you because we have here a call for action for everyone in ADB, how they can do their part in sustainable procurement, and even we ourselves, and how we support our member countries to build champions like Sanjay, who support champions, who build communities and institutions and share lessons learned and knowledge.
Thanks. I think the call for action is really start applying it and then contributing through creating the openings. We talk a lot about knowledge and process and tools, but to really make a difference, you really need to start applying it. So I think the call for action is really to create openings to enable the dialogues with the project team, with the country team, through the procurement focal, to work with the government, the market, supplier, as well as other institutions, CSO, to start really that change and that journey. And also incorporating that not only on the country dialogue level, but also on the project level, so that we together can collaborate and play our part to leverage procurement as a powerful tool to advance the broader outcome and climate agenda. And I think the second point is also to share information and examples. I think ADB is already doing a lot to some extent in the sustainable procurement space in different arrangement, different ways and form. For example, I know that colleagues, Mrs. CC is working on a Build for Skills program where is working with the government to introduce requirement in a contract to encourage adaptation of traineeship creation in a contract. So example like this would be good to be collated in the library that we're creating, so that there's one platform of resources and tools in our organization, and also maybe sharing with other agencies to sort of enhance each other's knowledge and experience.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, so this leads us to more conversations that we would like to have with Carsten at UNDP, and of course with Rainer. I would have loved to circle back to you on how do we create missions at the project level and even at our country partnership level, but I think this is for another time. And I also want to make sure that we acknowledge everyone is here, because you can't use the chat box. Are there any questions or comments you would like to give? You can now participate in person. Any last words or thoughts? Okay, from the panel, anyone would like to have a final word? That's for you, Sanjay.
I would like to say my message to the procurement professional who are, listening to this webinar, that you have an opportunity, to set your earlier image, right? Procurement has been always recognized as a backroom job, transactional job, colloquial job, whatever you call, right? But today you have an opportunity to make a difference, right? And be counted in the development of society, and be counted in improving the environment and the health of society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. So you just made procurement interesting and fun and a job which has a lot of impact. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. This was our first hybrid event, and we're looking forward to many more with you. Thank you.